Cold stone floors pressed against Eirik Vinterbo's cheek. A heavy shroud of velvet covered his stiff, pale limbs. The stench of gangrenous flesh choked the stagnant air. Blue, glowing veins pulsed rhythmically within his own vision. He blinked, but the analytical overlay remained burned into his sight. A royal crown lay discarded in a pool of drying black bile. The morgue was not a tomb, but a petri dish of rot. Eirik pushed the heavy stone slab aside with shaking hands. His lungs burned with the metallic tang of unsterilized decay. He stood, his joints popping like dry kindling in the silence. Around him, the bodies of the royal family lay in varying states of liquefaction. He focused his gaze on the youngest prince, stretched out on a marble table. The clinical eye flickered, revealing thick, dark clusters of pathogens colonizing the boy's throat. It was not divine wrath that claimed them. It was the lack of a simple boiling water protocol. He reached for a discarded surgical scalpel resting in a tray of grime. The steel was rusted, but the edge held a desperate sharpness. He made a precise incision along the prince's swollen lymph nodes. Black, viscous fluid seeped from the wound onto the cold floor. He leaned closer, observing the rapid replication of the bacteria. The air in the room seemed to hum with the weight of the infection. His own heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He needed to document the structural failure of the tissues before the guards returned. Footsteps echoed sharply against the arched stone ceiling of the crypt. The heavy thud of iron-shod boots signaled the arrival of the city watch. Eirik grabbed a scrap of parchment and a charcoal stick from the table. He sketched the bacterial colonies with frantic, precise movements. His hands trembled as the exhaustion of the clinical eye began to take hold. A piercing migraine flared behind his eyes, blurring his vision into jagged lines. He shoved the parchment into his tunic just as the door groaned open. Astrid Valen stepped into the dim light, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword. She stopped, her eyes widening at the sight of the desecrated royal corpse. Behind her, 2 armored guards drew their weapons with a metallic rasp. Eirik did not move, his feet planted firmly on the blood-slicked stone. He held the bloody scalpel, his breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. Astrid's face hardened into a mask of professional cold indifference. She gestured for the guards to seize the physician. They slammed him against the cold masonry wall. The impact jarred his vision, causing the glowing diagnostic overlay to stutter and fade. Astrid stepped forward, her boots crunching on broken glass. She demanded to know why a dead man dared to butcher the crown prince. Eirik met her gaze, his expression devoid of fear or submissive bowing. He told her the prince died of a filth-borne disease, not a curse. A guard struck him across the face with a mailed fist. The taste of copper filled his mouth as his head snapped to the side. Astrid signaled for them to drag him toward the surface. The transition from the cool, damp morgue to the harsh, torchlit corridors blinded him. They hauled him through the halls of the palace, past tapestries depicting ancient holy wars. He saw the nobility huddled in the distance, clutching perfumed rags to their faces. They moved with a strange, labored gait, their lungs struggling to draw air. The clinical eye flared, highlighting the faint, shimmering resonance patterns in their chests. He saw the purity system for what it was, a physical burden disguised as power. They reached the doors of the High Inquisitor's private chamber. The wood was carved with intricate, terrifying depictions of the black rot. The guards shoved him forward, forcing him to his knees on the velvet rug. High Inquisitor Håkon Mork sat behind a desk of polished, dark oak. He wore robes that smelled of incense and burning sage. His eyes were cold, predatory, and fixed on Eirik with undisguised hatred. The room felt heavy, the air thick with the scent of stagnant ozone. Mork leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He accused the physician of heresy and the desecration of sacred remains. Eirik looked up, his eyes meeting the Inquisitor's unwavering stare. He spoke of the microscopic truth he had witnessed in the morgue. He explained that the rot could be halted by fire and boiling water. Mork's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened on his quill. The Inquisitor signaled for the guards to prepare the executioner's block. Eirik felt the tremors in his hands worsen as the clinical eye pulsed. He focused on Mork's neck, seeing the early, jagged signs of the infection. The Inquisitor was already a host to the very plague he claimed to punish. Eirik spoke again, his voice steady despite the pain in his skull. He warned the Inquisitor that his own lungs were slowly turning to ash. The room went deathly silent as the realization hung in the air. Mork stopped, his hand hovering over the bell that would seal Eirik's fate. Mork's fingers trembled against the polished oak. The heavy silence in the chamber stretched thin. Eirik focused his gaze on the Inquisitor's neck. The clinical eye flickered with a faint, ghostly blue light. Jagged, dark nodules clustered beneath the man's skin. The infection was already feeding on the Inquisitor's vitality. Eirik pointed a steady finger at the pulsing veins. He described the exact path of the rot through the lungs. Mork's face turned a sickly, pale shade of gray. The bell on the desk remained untouched. Eirik leaned forward, his voice a low, calculated rasp. He offered a cure that the Inquisitor could not ignore. Mork's breath hitched in a shallow, rattling wheeze. The Inquisitor stared at his own shaking hands. He gestured vaguely toward the heavy iron doors. The guards loosened their grip on Eirik's shoulders. Astrid Valen stood by the entrance, her expression unreadable. She watched as Mork scribbled a seal onto a scroll. The parchment carried the royal crest of Ethelgard. Mork tossed the document onto the velvet rug. He warned Eirik that failure meant immediate public execution. Eirik stood up, his joints aching from the cold stone. He retrieved the scroll and turned toward the exit. Astrid followed him out into the long, torch-lit corridor. Her boots clicked rhythmically against the cold marble floor. She led him to a secluded wing of the palace. The air here tasted of damp earth and stale incense. They reached a set of heavy, reinforced wooden doors. Astrid pushed them open to reveal a makeshift infirmary. Rows of cots lined the room, filled with moaning patients. The smell of rot hung heavy in the stagnant air. Eirik walked to a wooden table covered in glass vials. He reached for his bag of surgical tools. His fingers brushed against the rough surface of the table. Something felt wrong about the arrangement of the supplies. He opened a jar of white powder intended for cleaning. The substance inside was damp and clumped with gray mold. He checked a bundle of bandages stacked neatly nearby. Stains of dark, oily residue marked the clean linen. Eirik looked up at the rafters of the room. Shadows danced against the walls, hiding the corners. He realized the supplies had been compromised from the start. Someone inside the palace wanted the patients to die. He turned to Astrid, his eyes scanning her face. She stood by the door, watching the dying with detachment. Eirik picked up a contaminated bandage with his tweezers. He held it out, showing her the deliberate rot. Astrid's hand tightened on the pommel of her sword. She walked closer, her eyes widening at the evidence. A shadow moved behind a curtain at the far end. Eirik dropped the tweezers and sprinted toward the corner. He shoved the heavy curtain aside with a sharp pull. A servant in plain gray robes scrambled toward the window. The figure clutched a leather pouch to their chest. Eirik lunged, his fingers catching the hem of the robe. The servant stumbled, crashing into a stack of wooden crates. A cloud of dust rose into the dim, flickering light. Eirik pinned the intruder against the cold stone wall. He grabbed the leather pouch and tore it open. Black, viscous sludge dripped from the container onto the floor. The servant's eyes darted toward the exit in terror. Eirik forced the man's chin up with a firm grip. He saw the mark of the miasma cult on the neck. The servant snarled, his voice a guttural, wet sound. He spat a glob of black bile at Eirik's face. Eirik ducked, the fluid sizzling against the stone floor. Astrid drew her blade in one fluid metallic motion. She stood over the servant, her face a cold mask. The servant collapsed, his body convulsing in rhythmic spasms. Dark, vein-like patterns spread rapidly across his pale skin. He died within seconds, his lungs filling with fluid. Eirik stared at the body, his heart hammering against his ribs. The clinical eye pulsed, revealing the source of the rot. It was not a natural disease, but a biological weapon. He looked at the supplies, then back at the corpses. The palace was not a sanctuary, but a breeding ground. Astrid sheathed her sword with a sharp, echoing click. She looked at Eirik, her eyes filled with newfound dread. The conspiracy reached deeper than the High Inquisitor. Eirik felt the familiar, sharp migraine behind his eyes. He steadied himself against a wooden support beam. The mission had changed from healing to uncovering a war. He gathered the remaining clean supplies into a locked chest. He turned to the patients, his hands shaking slightly. They were no longer just sick, they were being hunted. Eirik began the process of cleaning the room with fire. He lit a torch and held it to the contaminated rags. The flames roared, casting long, flickering shadows on the ceiling. The smell of burning rot filled the cramped infirmary. Astrid kept watch at the door, her hand on her weapon. Eirik worked through the night, his focus absolute and cold. He treated the most critical patient with a steady hand. The clinical eye identified the primary infection points in the throat. He drained the fluid, his movements precise and efficient. The patient's breathing slowed, becoming deep and rhythmic. Eirik stood back, his vision blurring from the exertion. He knew the saboteur would return when the sun rose. He prepared a trap using the remaining clean medical supplies. He placed a vial of caustic acid near the door hinge. He waited in the darkness, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The palace grew quiet. the only sound the wind outside. A faint footfall echoed in the hallway beyond the door. Eirik gripped his scalpel, his knuckles white with tension. The door handle turned, moving with agonizing, deliberate slowness. A silhouette appeared in the gap, hooded and silent. The figure stepped into the room, holding a glass flask. Eirik moved, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The intruder whirled around, a dagger drawn in their hand. Astrid stepped from the darkness, her sword point at their throat. The figure frozen, the flask slipping from their gloved fingers. It shattered against the floor, releasing a cloud of spores. Eirik covered his mouth with a cloth soaked in vinegar. He watched as the spores settled on the stone floor. The intruder fell to their knees, gasping for air. Their skin began to blister and peel in the heat. Eirik stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the dying culprit. He needed to know who had ordered the final strike. The intruder clutched their throat, their eyes wide with panic. They pointed a trembling finger toward the High Inquisitor's wing. The secret was out, but the danger was only beginning. Eirik looked at his own hands, stained with dark fluid. He had saved the patients, but he had lost his anonymity. Astrid stood by the window, looking out at the city. The lights of Ethelgard flickered in the distant, cold night. He knew the real war for the city had started. He walked to the window and stared into the dark. The plague was a tool, and he was now the target. Eirik stood atop a wooden crate in the center of the crowded slum square. He pointed a gloved finger at the central well, the source of the district's water. The water shimmered with a dull, greenish film that clung to the stone rim. He dropped a handful of quicklime into the basin, the chemical hissing on contact. A crowd of gaunt peasants huddled behind a barricade of rotted timber. They clutched rusted iron tools and jagged stones, their eyes wide with hunger and rage. A woman in a tattered shawl threw a bucket of mud at Eirik's chest. She screamed that he was poisoning the last of their holy water. Eirik wiped the sludge from his tunic, his expression flat and unreadable. He tapped his temple, and the clinical eye flickered into his vision. A web of glowing, sickly yellow veins pulsed beneath the surface of the well. The pathogen concentration was critical, a death sentence for anyone who drank. He looked down at the crowd, his voice steady despite the rising roar of the mob. He explained that the water was not a blessing, but a vessel for the black rot. The crowd surged forward, the wooden barricade groaning under their combined weight. Astrid Valen stepped from the shadows of an alley, her hand resting on her sword hilt. She drew her blade, the steel ringing like a bell against the damp, cold air. The mob hesitated, the sight of the city watch captain silencing their initial charge. Astrid commanded them to stand down, her voice a sharp crack of authority. Eirik turned back to the well, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He needed to filter the sediment before the corruption reached the lower pipes. He grabbed a heavy iron strainer, his fingers trembling with the onset of the migraine. The clinical eye flared bright red, overloading his synapses with too much data. His vision blurred, turning the world into a smear of jagged, pulsing light. He stumbled, his knees hitting the wet cobblestones with a sickening thud. The world tilted sideways, the sky spinning into a vortex of gray clouds. Astrid caught him by the shoulder, her grip firm and grounded. She looked at the peasants, then back at the unconscious physician in her arms. The mob saw his collapse as a sign of divine judgment against his interference. They surged forward again, emboldened by the sudden weakness of their enemy. Astrid shoved Eirik behind a stone fountain, shielding him with her own body. She swung her sword in a wide, warning arc, keeping the desperate crowd at bay. The peasants scattered, but one figure slipped through the confusion toward the cart. A hooded youth grabbed the leather satchel containing Eirik's detailed research notes. The thief vanished into the labyrinth of narrow, smoke-filled alleys. Astrid stood over Eirik, watching the thief disappear into the dark mist. She cursed under her breath, the weight of the lost data sinking in. The notes contained the only record of the pathogen's mutation patterns. Without them, the quarantine protocols would collapse within a single day. Eirik groaned, his hand clutching the side of his head in agony. The motor neuron tremors racked his body, his fingers clawing at the stone floor. He opened his eyes, but his vision remained fractured and deeply inconsistent. He looked at the empty spot where his satchel had rested moments before. He realized the theft was not a coincidence, but a calculated move by the cult. The mob began to disperse, leaving the square in a heavy, ominous silence. Astrid knelt beside him, her face etched with a rare, visible concern. She told him the notes were gone, stolen by a swift-footed shadow. Eirik struggled to sit up, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. He looked at the well, then at his trembling, empty hands. The mission was failing, and the city was losing its only defense. He forced himself to stand, leaning heavily against the cold fountain wall. He knew the High Inquisitor would use this failure to justify his execution. Astrid gripped his arm, offering the support he could no longer provide himself. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rot from the lower districts. They moved toward the infirmary, leaving the contaminated well behind them. The streets were empty, the silence of the slums feeling like a gathering storm. Eirik felt the weight of the city's impending death in every heavy step. He looked at the high palace towers, glowing with the warm light of the elite. The nobles were safe, shielded by their walls and their ignorance. He reached the infirmary door and pushed it open with a heavy thud. Inside, the room was cold, the candles long since burned to their wicks. He searched the desk, his hands frantic and desperate for his lost work. The parchment was gone, leaving only blank, mocking surfaces behind. He slammed his fist against the wood, the impact jarring his aching head. Astrid watched from the threshold, her eyes scanning the dark, empty corners. The thief had known exactly where to look and exactly what to take. There was a spy among them, someone who fed the cult his secrets. Eirik walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling, dying city. He felt the clinical eye pulse one last time, a fading, rhythmic heartbeat. The war for Æthelgard had entered a new, darker phase of attrition. He turned to Astrid, his face a mask of cold, calculated resolve. They would need to rebuild the data from memory before the next sunrise. The survival of the slums depended on a man who had lost everything. Eirik stood at the edge of the forbidden district. The iron gate groaned as he pushed it open. He stepped into a courtyard paved with white marble. Golden lanterns hung from the rafters of a sprawling villa. He saw a group of nobles gathered in the center. They wore silk masks embroidered with silver thread. His stolen satchel lay open on a stone pedestal. A man in a velvet cloak turned a page of his research. Eirik squinted at the scene. The clinical eye flickered to life in his left iris. Blue lines of light traced the air around the nobles. He saw the pathogens swirling inside their lungs. The infection was not killing them. It was vibrating in rhythm with their breathing. The noble holding the notes inhaled a sharp, rattling breath. A wave of golden resonance rippled outward from his chest. The marble floor cracked under the sheer sonic pressure. Eirik ducked behind a heavy limestone pillar. He understood the terrible truth of the elite. The black rot acted as a catalyst for their power. The fever state allowed them to channel resonance energy. They were not victims of the plague. They were parasites feeding on the misery of Æthelgard. He tightened his grip on his surgical scalpel. The research notes contained his map to a cure. If he destroyed the rot, he would strip them of their strength. He would also leave the city defenseless against their physical blades. A noble laughed, the sound echoing like a glass bell. He tossed a handful of coins onto the pile of notes. The thief stood in the shadows, waiting for his payment. Eirik stepped out from behind the pillar. He did not hide his presence. The nobles turned, their masks glinting in the lantern light. The lead noble stepped forward, his eyes bright with fever. He recognized the physician from the infirmary. Eirik pointed his blade at the stolen satchel. He demanded the return of his stolen scientific records. The noble chuckled, a wet, rattling sound in his throat. He told Eirik that knowledge was a dangerous burden. He claimed the plague was the foundation of their order. Eirik felt the clinical eye pulse with agonizing heat. His vision fractured into 1,000 shards of red. He stumbled, but forced his feet to hold the ground. The noble raised a hand, his fingers glowing with resonance. The air around Eirik grew heavy and distorted. He felt the pressure building in his own eardrums. He lunged forward, ignoring the tremors in his hands. He struck the pedestal with the hilt of his blade. The satchel tumbled into the dirt. Eirik snatched the leather bag and backed away. The nobles surged forward, their voices rising in a discordant choir. The ground shook as their resonance shattered the nearby fountains. He sprinted toward the garden wall. He vaulted the stone barrier and hit the muddy alleyway. He did not look back at the villa. He clutched the notes to his chest like a holy relic. The weight of his discovery burned in his mind. He could unleash the cure and trigger a massacre, or he could keep the secret and watch the city wither. The sounds of the resonance faded into the distance. He reached the edge of the slums. The smell of death hung thick in the stagnant air. He saw a mother clutching her child in the doorway. The child's skin was gray and mottled with rot. Eirik looked at his bag of notes. The cure was a simple chemical adjustment. It was a path to salvation, or a path to slaughter. He stood in the dark, the city breathing around him. He realized the choice was already made. He could not let the rot consume the innocent. He would save the people from the plague. Then he would find a way to break the nobles. He turned toward the infirmary, his stride resolute. The clinical eye dimmed, leaving him in the cold darkness. He walked into the fog of the lower districts. The war for Æthelgard had finally begun. Eirik hunched over his makeshift workbench in the damp cellar of the infirmary. Glass vials clattered against the stone surface as he arranged his limited supplies. The clinical eye pulsed in his left iris, casting a faint blue glow over the table. He pressed a lancet into his own forearm, his hand trembling from the exertion. Dark, viscous blood dripped into a ceramic bowl mixed with concentrated vinegar and lime. He watched the solution through the microscopic lens, searching for the telltale pathogen. The black rot bacteria shriveled and dissolved upon contact with his own antibodies. He dipped a thin needle into the mixture, his face pale and slick with sweat. A knock echoed against the heavy oak door, muffled by the layers of filth. Astrid Valen stepped into the room, her armor clanking with every cautious movement. She held a rusted iron lantern, its flame flickering in the stagnant cellar air. Eirik did not look up from his work, his focus locked on the needle. He warned her that the mixture was volatile and required immediate human testing. Astrid gripped the hilt of her sword, her knuckles white beneath her leather gloves. She told him the palace guards were closing in on his location for treason. Eirik stood, his vision blurring as the clinical eye demanded a heavy toll. He pressed the vial into her hand, urging her to distribute it to the dying. Astrid hesitated, her eyes searching his face for a sign of madness. She gripped the vial tightly and vanished into the shadows of the lower tunnels. Eirik slumped against the wall, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. A sudden sharp crash shattered the silence from the floor above his head. Footsteps, heavy with iron boots, thundered down the narrow stone stairway. High Inquisitor Håkon Mørk stepped into the cellar, his robe stained with dark ritual symbols. He looked at the discarded medical tools with a sneer of pure religious contempt. Mørk accused Eirik of poisoning the city's elite with his heretical surgical vanity. The Inquisitor gestured to the floor, where the body of a high-ranking official lay. The official's throat was slit with clinical precision, a clear frame for the physician. Eirik stared at the corpse, understanding the trap that had been set for him. Mørk drew a long, serrated blade, its edge glowing with a sickly, necrotic green. The Inquisitor inhaled deeply, expanding his chest to channel the power of resonance. The air in the cellar grew distorted, vibrating with the force of his lungs. Eirik lunged to the side as a sonic shockwave pulverized the wooden workbench. Splinters of oak rained down, one grazing his cheek and drawing a line of blood. He scrambled toward the ventilation grate, his muscles screaming in protest. Mørk roared, his voice amplified into a deafening, discordant boom of pure malice. The stone walls cracked, shedding dust like snow onto the damp earthen floor. Eirik kicked the iron grate, his boots tearing through the rusted, brittle metal. He squeezed into the narrow shaft, pulling his body through the jagged opening. Behind him, the cellar collapsed under the weight of Mørk's resonant sonic rage. He crawled through the darkness, the smell of sulfur and rot clinging to his skin. He emerged into the alleyway, the cold night air biting at his exposed flesh. In the distance, the bells of Æthelgard tolled, signaling the start of the purge. He looked toward the slums and saw a faint golden light flickering in the windows. Astrid's scouts were moving, delivering the vaccine to the desperate, shivering masses. He saw a child drink from a vial, the gray rot on his skin beginning to fade. The pathogen within the boy's blood died, leaving behind a clear, healthy complexion. Eirik felt a cold satisfaction, despite the burning pain behind his left eye. He was a criminal, an outlaw branded by the highest authority in the land. He stood in the shadows, watching the plague retreat from the lower districts. A squad of city guards rounded the corner, their torches casting long, hungry shadows. Eirik turned and sprinted toward the city gates, his silhouette lost in the fog. His reputation was shattered, his name cursed by every noble in the capital city. But in the dark, crowded hovels of the poor, a silent revolution had begun. He vanished into the labyrinthine streets, a ghost haunted by his own mercy. The war for the soul of Æthelgard had moved from the palace. He disappeared into the thick, swirling mist, leaving the dying city behind him. Eirik pressed his back against the cold stone of the canal wall. He watched a hooded figure emerge from the sewer grate. The man wore the tattered robes of the miasma cult. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest with trembling fingers. Eirik stepped from the shadows and leveled a scalpel at the stranger's throat. The cultist dropped to his knees, his eyes wide with frantic terror. He whispered that the high priests were mere puppets for something older. He pointed a shaking hand toward the distant, darkened spires of the cathedral. A pulsating, translucent mass sat coiled within the base of Håkon Mørk's spine. The clinical eye flickered, projecting a map of the parasite's fibrous, necrotic tendrils. It fed directly on the fever heat of the host's resonant energy. The cultist begged for mercy, claiming the parasite controlled the city's armory keys. Eirik studied the anatomical rendering, his breath hitching in his chest. The parasite was entwined with Mørk's central nervous system. He could not remove the organism without severing the Inquisitor's life force. A sudden, rhythmic thudding shook the cobblestones beneath their feet. The cultists pointed toward the great iron gates of Ethelgard. Cracks spiderwebbed across the reinforced metal as a massive shape slammed against them. Something gargantuan shrieked from the other side, a sound like grinding glass. The gates groaned, the iron bowing outward under a relentless, unnatural force. Eirik looked at the armory key hanging from Mork's distant, guarded belt. He knew the weapons within were the only hope against the coming tide. He signaled the cultists to move, his mind racing through surgical possibilities. They sprinted toward the inner sanctum, dodging patrols of zealots. The air grew thick with the cloying, sweet stench of rotting vegetation. A massive tentacle, slick with black bile, burst through the city wall. It swept through a row of houses, pulverizing wood and stone into splinters. The monsters were inside the gates, their hulking forms veiled in thick fog. Eirik reached the cathedral courtyard, his lungs burning from the exertion. High Inquisitor Håkon Mork stood on the dais, his eyes glowing with necrotic light. He raised his hands, his voice booming with the power of forced resonance. The parasite beneath his skin pulsed, matching the rhythm of his chant. Eirik activated the clinical eye, his vision blurring as migraines tore through his skull. He saw the weak point in the parasite's connection, a microscopic junction of nerves. He gripped his scalpel, his fingers trembling from the rapid drain of his vitality. He needed to strike the host without ending the life he needed to save. The wall behind him collapsed, revealing a horde of plague-mutated nightmares. They poured into the plaza, their limbs elongated and skin weeping black pus. Eirik realized the parasite was not just a master, it was a beacon. It called the swarm to the heart of Ethelgard, to the source of the infection. He looked at you, watching from the edge of the screen as the city crumbles into the dark. You see the rot spreading from the screen into your own room, the same miasma that choked the life from those streets. You are not just a spectator to this collapse. You are the next host in the cycle, and the infection has already begun to take root in the silence of your own breath.